Okay, so welcome everybody to the third in our spring seminar series at the Media Policy and Culture Research Group at the University of Antwerp. I've talked to Whitney and Ryan. They're both okay if people want to tweet. I know people are not, as a group, we're not full of hyperactive tweeters, but if anybody would like to tweet, feel free to do that during the seminar. Whitney and Ryan are going to speak for about 40-50 minutes, and we'll go for an hour and a half like the other seminars. So that gives us, at least 40 minutes or so for Q&A and discussion. And if you would like to add a question at the end, feel free to come on, turn on your video, turn on your microphone. And if you want to ask a question, feel free to use the hand icon or the chat box function. Blah, 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 all the Zoom stuff. So a little brief note about today's speakers. So we're delighted to have a joint presentation from Professor Whitney Phillips of Syracuse University and Professor Ryan Milner of the College of Charleston in South Carolina. Whitney and Ryan, as individual authors, have done lots of acclaimed, impressive work in recent years that has illuminated the often vague, nebulous underpinnings, political, ideological underpinnings of online culture. Whitney was the author of the 2016 book, This Is Why We Can't Have Nice Things, mapping the relationship between online trolling and mainstream culture, while Ryan published the 2016 book, The World Made Me, Public Conversations and Participatory Media. As co-authors, in 2017, they published a book with the wonderfully suggestive title of The Ambivalent Internet, which is a title that comes to mind, I think, about just about every day I log on to Twitter. I think of how it resonates with what I see in front of me. A book which was completed right on the eve, I know there was a supplementary footnote, of Trump's election in 2016. And today they're here to talk about their new book, which I guess offers a kind of sequel to the earlier book, and which I see from the foreword was completed the day after, or at least signed off officially the day after the 2020 US election. So today they're not only going to talk about the substantive arguments of the book, they're also going to reflect on their own work processes as co-authors. That's enough from me. I'll now hand it over to Whitney and Ryan. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen now. Success? Can we see?
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it.
Great. Okay, cool.
We're good. All right. So yeah, thank you, Sean, for the invite. We are honored to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming out, or I guess coming out to your Zoom box to have a conversation with us today. We're going to today divide our talk into 3 different sections. We're going to first talk about the book that we just wrote. I've got it right here because we got our copies in. You Are Here, a field guide for navigating polarized speech, conspiracy theories, and our polluted media landscape. So we'll talk about that book, its main arguments, coming from our history of looking at internet culture, the relationship between internet culture and the politics of everyday life, and all the significance that happens when people get online, for better and worse, very often for worse. So we'll talk about the main arguments in that book. We'll then turn to a conversation about the process of writing that book together. We've done a lot of writing together over many, many years, and it's been a process to figure out how to effectively, as co-authors, produce more cultural studies or humanities centered arguments. And we often have people asking us, as much as they talk about the content of our work, asking us about the process. How do you do this as a co-authored pair? So we thought we'd reflect on that a little bit. And then we will end by looking ahead and looking at where this argument is going to go, where we're taking it in specific. We've got a really exciting, interesting opportunity ahead of us to translate You Are Here and the arguments in that book about our polluted media landscape to middle grades audiences, to young teenagers who really need to have those conversations. And we know the content, but we are having to learn how to write to a whole different audience than we're used to writing to. So we're going to talk some about that as well. So the book we wrote, how we wrote it, and the new audiences we're translating it to is the agenda for today.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having us here. We're really excited to share all of those things, especially the discussion of how we wrote the book. Again, we have a lot of, back when this would happen, a lot of conversations in bars after panels, but not a lot of conversations in public in this kind of setting. So really excited to dive into that. So just to give an overview, though, of what You Are Here is about, essentially, You Are Here tells the story of the Trump era. And at the outset, Sean mentioned that we finished our last book, The Ambivalent Internet, the day after the 2016 election. So the book was totally finished. But for those of you in the audience who have written books, you know that up until a point, you can make changes. You can make changes to pages. You can make changes to then sentences, and then you can't make any changes. And so we were at the point where you could not make any more changes. But because this happened in 2016, the press threw us a bone and allowed us to add a footnote that Donald Trump had just won the election. This was at noon the day after 2016. And so You Are Here, it kind of picks up exactly where that book left off. And it tells the story of what happened during the Trump era. I mean, it contextualizes, for instance, the years-long emergence of conspiracy theories like QAnon and the deep state, and how all of those energies were exacerbated by the COVID crisis. But besides sort of telling the story of the Trump years, the book is exploring how we got a President Trump, how this person happened to US American politics. What energies had been percolating for years and years, and in some cases decades, before the 2016 election cycle.
So one major focus in the book is, in a couple of words, media literacy. But even though we talk a lot about media literacy, we don't really use the term media literacy in and of itself too much. And that's because what we found is that a lot of conversations, especially popular conversations about media literacy, which is very often framed as a way to fight polluted information on the internet, they're really individual focused. They're really focused on producing a to-do list. Check your facts, verify your sources, think critically. If you check off those things, then congratulations, you've accomplished media literacy. And what we wanted to do in the book is really explore what more there could be to being literate in our really complex, convoluted information landscape that we deal with online. Because if it was as simple as check your facts, think critically, verify your sources, then we wouldn't have a problem with polluted information. We wouldn't have a problem with misinformation, with disinformation. We wouldn't have lies and conspiracies, theories flying all around. If these solutions that we have that are kind of popularly put in the box of media literacy were all we needed, then the problem would be a little better managed. And it's not a managed problem. So we wanted to explore media literacy in a more complex way by asking readers to think about the information landscape around them, and not just how to protect themselves from the lies and the falsehoods and the conspiracy theories that are going around, and not just to combat them, but to think about their own parts in creating an information landscape that is polluted. We ask readers, and this is why we call the book You Are Here, to situate themselves within their own networks and think about their own stuff that they're sharing, even if they think they're doing their best to help the world around them. They might be responsible for some pollution themselves. And so in order to help readers situate themselves, we do a lot of our framing in the book. We frame this information landscape using a series of ecological metaphors. We use stories, biographical, historical, to talk about our information environment as an ecology.
Yeah, and so one of these metaphors, the slide, one of these metaphors is polluted information. And we use that rather than mis or disinformation, which tends to be the preferred terminology, certainly in the US. And polluted information as a frame is doing quite a lot of work throughout each chapter. And in describing, what it is it does, it also speaks to why we prefer polluted information over something like mis or disinformation. So, one of the first things that it does is it highlights the broader environmental consequences of networked information. We're not just talking about the specific thing that is or is not true. It's what are the downstream consequences, what happens ecologically. And that frame also is directing attention to, what, regardless of why someone shares something, if, misinformation is false or misleading information that is inadvertently spread, and disinformation is false and misleading information that is deliberately spread. Regardless of those consequences, regardless of the motives, what matters is the consequences of what gets spread. Who cares why it gets started? Well, not who cares, but often you can't tell. And so why focus all of your energies, your analytic energies, on how it got started and what somebody meant? What did it do? That's what the polluted frame allows us to focus on. And focusing on the impact of that pollution too, rather than just sort of getting stuck with the individual person who created it. In addition to that, it zeroes in on the environmental justice elements of this conversation. The fact that online harm is just not equally distributed. Historically underrepresented populations are simply more likely to be polluted where they live, work, and play. That's true offline, it's true online. And talking about pollution means we get to talk about justice. And you don't really see that in the same way when it is a conversation about mis or disinformation, because again, that then makes the focus the information itself rather than these sort of broader structures. And perhaps most important, a polluted information frame allows us to more thoughtfully consider how we all can pollute simply by going about our day-to-day lives. Because it's not just the industrial polluters, you could say, or the people who actively set out to pollute that have an enormous impact on the landscape. The polluted information metaphor allows us to think about the people who aren't industrial polluters and who aren't intending to pollute, who still have a similar kind of effect on the landscape, which, if you're not an industrial polluter, if you're not Fox News, you're not going to have as much of an immediate, enormous impact, but individual impacts, even small impacts, they accumulate. So small pollution travels to big places and big pollution travels to small places. And pollution allows us to really think about those interconnections. And so this metaphor suffuses the rest of the book, all of the other metaphors that we focus on. And those metaphors, which build on the pollution metaphor, include root systems, land cultivation, and hurricanes, which we'll cover now. So
the first ecological metaphor we use to talk about polluted information is redwood root systems, which in the natural world, redwood root systems, like many root systems in really dense forests, are these intricate interconnections. In a forest, the individual trees that you see above ground, below ground, are far from individual. Their roots intertwine, they connect. There's some really cool science that I am not equipped to tell you about in detail about specific funguses helping these root systems connect to each other and helping individual trees communicate with each other. And we use that metaphor to point out that in our online environments, any pollution introduced in one side of a grove, in one cluster of participation online, will swiftly filter out, feeding into surrounding groves and groves beyond that. This metaphor asked us to remember that we have to be extremely careful about the stuff that we're adding, even to our small networks, our group chats, our forums, our individual threads, stuff that we think is behind closed doors or that no one will ever see, because it's so easy for the little pollution we're doing in little spaces to travel out in highly unpredictable ways. The primary example we use to talk about this spread in the book, the chapter that Sean is on right now, is early internet culture. In the kind of early to mid aughts in the US, the pockets of participation that were really niche and really small in 2003 and 4, sites like 4chan, eventually Reddit, Tumblr, cascading out to YouTube and Twitter, and how there were norms on those sites that seemed okay enough at the time, and people gave a pass at the time. Things like, barbed detached irony or an agonistic way of communicating, or ironic, jokey racism or sexism, this kind of way of being in the world that punched down a lot, that told us never to take anything seriously, to not be empathetic, to not be earnest. That was the niche pattern of participation on these smaller corners of the internet. But as that became internet culture, and internet culture spread as a cultural norm across a lot of different social media, then all of a sudden we saw those ways of being, those kinds of jokes, those kinds of agonisms spreading out really widely, spreading out in more serious and more dangerous ways. And so we have to pay attention when we're looking at pollution, not just at the individual act or the individual site. We have to look at network structures and affordances. This metaphor reminds us that the internet is a network and it's structured together and it is designed to be frictionless and it's designed for things to spread with a lot of speed, without a lot of impediments. And we have to think about how information travels even beyond where we think it's traveling. We have to look at the actual infrastructure of the internet, the actual tubes, and what they encourage to spread.
So the next metaphor is land cultivation. And land cultivation, it highlights how individual social media users influence their networks, often simply by existing in them. It emphasizes that anyone and everyone can ultimately lose polluted information into whole other environments. And that's regardless of intent and regardless of whether someone has any inkling that something might be polluted. And the example that we give in the chapter is, so building off of what we describe in terms of what got put in the networks through early internet culture, how those sort of norms and lulls as an aspirational register and all the sort of trolly stuff, the ironic racism, that once it got put in the soil and people, started working that soil and growing crops from that soil, bringing those crops to market in sort of metaphorical and literal ways, that ultimately contributed to the Trump era. That it wasn't that Donald Trump just sort of managed to crest over this wave and suddenly appear in U.S. politics just out of nowhere. Part of the reason that he and the MAGA worldview more broadly was able to kind of enter into public discourse and take up so much space within it was because when it first appeared, for many people within these early internet culture circles who ultimately got jobs at various center-left news outlets in the United States and were writing in technology sections, they thought it was trolling. They thought it all was pretty funny because it looked a lot like the jokes that they had been participating in and sharing and laughing at in this very lulzy way since they were teenagers. And so that wasn't why Trump won, but it helped sort of sow the fields in a really significant way that helped sort of normalize and allow white supremacy to kind of enter into the public mainstream sphere. And so we have to think about, when we're talking about the kind of land that we're cultivating, what we grow and what we bring to market. Any of us, even those of us who are pointing at something terrible in order to laugh at it or call it racist or whatever, we're still contributing to those outcomes. Everybody is part of what the farm ultimately produces. And that's what this particular metaphor asks people to focus on. That everyday choices of social media end users, whether they're high profile, whether they're not high profile, all have vast environmental consequences. And you miss that when the only people you're focusing on are the loudest MAGA supporters or Donald Trump himself. You have to say, who was working the land? How many people were working the land in what ways? And so that's what this metaphor focuses on.
And then last, we look to the sky and we talk about hurricanes, something unfortunately near and dear to my heart, living in the southeast of the US. Hurricanes bring all of this together. They highlight the fact that no story or controversy online is just one thing. An actual hurricane in nature is made up of a lot of things: water temperature, wind currents. Its effects are the result of coastal development, whether it's high or low tide when a storm passes by, ends up really mattering to the damage that is done. And in our online environments, anytime we run into major cascading examples of polluted information, of disinformation, of conspiracy theories that cascade out into great effect, they're not just one thing. We label them one thing. We label them QAnon, but they're really the result of all these different variables from insiders and outsiders alike, all coming together to give energy to a storm that grows and grows and grows, the more energy that small components of that storm give it. So the primary focus of this metaphor is on the many points of overlap we see in online interaction, in our media landscape more broadly, interaction and overlap between corporate media and grassroots media, randos on YouTube, and then news organizations covering the randos on YouTube, and then the randos on YouTube talking about the news organizations covering them. The audience is getting into the conversation as well. This community and all these other communities, people and the technologies they use, the way that they take information between networks, the way they take information offline to embodied spaces like rallies or family gatherings. And then very importantly, between what's not seen as explicit pollution or what's not thought of as explicit pollution, and then what ends up polluting the information landscape, because information does travel unpredictably, accruing energy as the network twists and turns all that new information in all these unpredictable ways. So the example that we use in this chapter to highlight this complexity is political conspiracy theories, particularly focusing on QAnon. And the story of QAnon is definitely one of this converging hurricane of multiple energies. When we first started writing about QAnon, when we first started writing about ideas about the deep state, they were considered relatively fringe. They were popping up on a few forums. They were kind of esoteric. The story of QAnon is one of a couple random posts on 4chan, on 8chan, that then get picked up and talked about on YouTube, and then other people start coming along. In the beginning, it's kind of laughed off by some people. I remember the reference site Know Your Meme called it a live action role play of people who believe that there's a deep state, and then a plant in the deep state trying to save us from the deep state, and all the people trying to decode the messages. So it starts off as niche, but then it gets journalistic coverage, and then people online notice some of that journalistic coverage, and they try to play that journalistic coverage, doing things like coordinating online to all wear shirts at this rally. So then journalists will see everybody wearing QAnon shirts at the Trump rally, and then talk about QAnon, which is then going to bring more people to Google QAnon and then find their forums. And so you get this buzzing activity. It spills out to Facebook, to TikTok. It spills out to in-person events and gatherings. It goes from something that might have been serious, might not have been serious, to something that is deadly serious, to the point of being a large animating factor in a lot of the belief systems that drove people to the US Capitol in mid-January to commit a whole lot of violence. And so the hurricane metaphor reminds us that when we're looking at these vast systems of polluted information online, we have to consider all these contingent components at once. And that's a challenging endeavor, but we hope that the metaphors help us understand these twists and turns.
Yeah, so all of those metaphors, they're setting the argument up. They give us a way to talk about overwhelming problems in a more concrete way, especially utilizing, images or locations that people are familiar with. If you're talking about something super esoteric and super complicated, especially people who might not be especially technology savvy, using a redwood metaphor, right? It's more inclusive. It allows more people to sort of understand the underlying processes, even if they don't necessarily know very much about how algorithms work, for example. But more than that, more than sort of opening up the conversation to as many people as possible, what we hope these metaphors inspire in readers is to reflect on their own experiences, their own stories. So if readers connect and apply the metaphors that we're using, then the argument is opened up to a world, much bigger than the book itself. And ultimately, this is what the you and you are here is referring to. We want readers. We're not just saying, the internet is the ecosystem. Like that's not what we're trying to do. We're not locking down meaning. We're trying to open meaning up. We want readers to use these to think about how they fit in their information ecosystems. And even, and maybe especially, if they don't think of their own actions as polluting at all. They're not a conspiracy theorist, they're not actively sowing disinformation, they're not Donald Trump. Those are the folks who we would like to take these metaphors so that they can apply them and tell their own stories with them.
So even if you're none of those things, even if you're none of those people, and I don't think Donald Trump is in our Zoom room right now, we all exist within an information ecosystem. And we wanted with the book to help people better think in those ecological terms. So that way they could better equip themselves to navigate the sludge. Instead of just how can I protect myself from pollution, it's how have I been engulfed in pollution? How have I weathered the storm? How might I have unintentionally contributed to this pollution? What can I change on my end as a participant in this really ambivalent system? So that reflection, we hope, encourages readers to situate themselves within the book's argument. And so the metaphors we use, they're a heuristic in this way. They're a tool that we hope can help people think of the problem, think of possible solutions a little differently. Most specifically, we want these metaphors to nudge readers away from the self-focused individualism that you get with a lot of media literacy conversations. Here is what I, as an individual, can do to protect myself. Here are my rights as an internet participant to share what I want. Here are my individual responsibilities. Instead, we want to think in a more communitarian way, more communal ethic. So instead of my rights and my freedoms from restriction on my speech or my ability to share what I want on the open internet, we want people to think about the freedoms the rest of the community has to be protected from pollution. And we want individuals to think of themselves as members of a network and think about what they share in that really network sense. Because one thing that the internet has shown us, it's always been true, but one thing that's maybe even more true now is that we're all in this together. We're all connected together. And so we have to be thinking more communally about the stuff that we're sharing and not sharing online.
And that involves a lot of shared responsibility. It's not just a question of rights. It's about our responsibility to the people we share our spaces with. And so the book is really, that's what the book is looking to do. It's foregrounding that every individual person is a you to someone else. And that all of those I's and all of those U's are fundamentally intertwined, interconnected. We're always impacting each other. And the only way that we're going to start trying to make things better is by thinking of the collective, and in that thought, in that sort of ecological reflection, deciding what to share and what not to share. And so the stories that we're telling it's all about capturing and trying to emphasize the importance of that communitarian ethic. So that's what we wrote. That's what the book is. And so now we're going to shift into more of a conversation. Sorry, my dog's coming over to say hi. Hello, world. So we're going to shift into a discussion of, how we wrote the book and how we have written other things in our careers. So okay.
Yeah, so a bit of background on our collaborative process. We've been writing together officially since 2014. As Sean said at the outset, we had the Ambivalent Internet before you were here. We've done before that and between that book chapters and popular press articles, a lot of co-writing, co-presentation. We just realized we both got our PhDs in 2012 and we're working on similar dissertations. Through that process, Whit was covering online trolling, I was covering online memes. So we were pointed to each other's work a whole lot. And so we started talking and then decided to start collaborating. And that collaboration process was a process. There were some failures early on as we got our legs under us in terms of writing as a cultural studies team, as a humanities-based team. I remember one example early on in the process of writing the Ambivalent Internet, Whit had written a chapter and then I was going to do revisions on the chapter. And I went in and I treated it as if I had written the chapter and I just completely dismantled it and I moved stuff around and I cut language and I turned it into this whole different thing without much comment, without much explanation. And then I went off to Germany for a symposium for like a week. And I left Whit holding this chapter that had been kind of completely demolished with no concern for where she was at on stuff, no concern for ego. And I was kind of unresponsive for that next week with her going, what were you trying to do with this? And me not being able to respond to that for a few days. And it really slowed down the process. And it caused us to have to begin to think about process so that we could get through writing stuff without ending up hating each other. And we've accomplished that. And above and beyond that, I think that we've gotten to a really good system to where our co-authorship process, we thrive together and we write, I'd say, better together than individually.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I won't speak for what, she's nodding. Okay, good.
I am. Yes.
Right. So we're going to share some of that process because like we said, we find that this is something that a lot of people are interested in, is how you produce this kind of more humanities-based storytelling, analytic kind of argument as a pair of co-authors, because it's a little more rare than it is in more the harder social scientists. So we'll talk about some of our steps. Go on.
And also because our writing style, we're trying to be inclusive in how we're writing it. So we're not just writing for other academics. And when you don't write just for other academics, there's more consideration. Sorry, my dog is doing something. Mm. There's more consideration for sort of voice. And it's not that academic writing doesn't have voice, it often does. But if you're writing for other academics, there's more of an established style that you adhere to. If you step outside of that, you have to then kind of negotiate how you're going to balance a theoretical focus with more of an accessibility focus. And that is something that even individual academic writers, it took me a long time to figure out how to do that on my own. Balancing the creative aspects of that with another person becomes very tricky because you've got not just two sets of ideas that you've got to meld, you've got two distinct voices that you have to figure out how to contend with. So, and we're not going to pretend in this that, we, after that experience in Germany, we just figured it all out and everything has been smooth sailing since then. I mean, what we're going to go through in just a second, this is what we've come to on the other side of You Are Here. So even at certain moments in the early days of working on You Are Here, we would kind of do miniature versions of what Ryan just described, where one person would kind of dive into language and assume that they knew what the other person meant, and then edit the language towards the assumed meaning. And then the other person would come in and would be like, what the hell did you just do? Like, that was not what I was saying. And it would just slow things down. So this is what we developed, realizing how careful we need to be about when we actually engage with language and when we have conversations and how to just streamline the process. So we're going to go through each of these steps. And the first most obvious step, and let me go here. The first most obvious step is to choose who is going to be, well, that's not related, is who's going to be the lead or the first author and who's going to be the second author. And we're, in the book overall, technically my name comes first, but we needed to decide in which chapter, okay, who's going to be the person who is first and who's the person who's second. So figure out who that's going to be. And then also a note to all of this work would take place in Google Docs. I suppose you could try to do this in a more static Word situation, but that sounds exhausting and confusing. So, okay, so the first one is the brainstorming phase for us. Oh, hold on. I just clicked out of my notes. One moment, please. I don't know how I just did that. There it is. Sorry about that. Okay, so the first is the brainstorming phase, that we give a lot of time to brainstorming, a lot of back and forth between the two of us to settle on the shape of the argument, what needs to be covered, and the overall sort of ethos of what we're trying to do. And much of this happens via text or signal, to be exact. And it tends to be woven in more everyday conversations. So we're just like, we're friends. Ryan and I are friends, and we'll just talk about our days, and then we'll sort of start talking a little bit about, things we think about in a chapter or whatever.
So yeah, it's text, and then also a lot of really long voice memos to each other. As we
realized that was easier because we were like, this texting, we lose the thread. So yeah, lots of voice memos that are interspersed with like personal, just talking about our days, and then also, I was thinking about this thing. So we do a great deal of brainstorming beforehand. And as we're doing that, we have a Google Doc that we've created, and we start dropping in links and oftentimes bits of text exchange, this total disorganized sort of mess. And through that, we start to identify areas where, okay, what are some research questions that we want to pursue? Who wants to look into that? Who wants to read this text? Who wants to sort of begin to test out those theories by doing some phase.
Then we refine the brainstorming. We continue this back and forth about what we're seeing. We start to make adjustments and refinements to the shape and the trajectory of the project. We continue adding new details to the doc, right? So as our questions come into focus, as our key ideas come into focus, we focus down this kind of really chaotic back and forth. We kind of begin at this point in formal coding and organizing of our raw data, our raw materials. For us, at least lately, that means a lot of news coverage, media coverage, tweets about news coverage and media coverage. We do kind of the very typical beginnings of the inductive patterns and themes. And we start figuring out what needs to be its own section, what do we want to emphasize as we answer the questions that we have, so that when we encounter more raw materials, more evidence, more in our travels throughout the internet, we got a place to put them. So we're bringing things into focus as we start to refine this brainstorming.
And then we move on to what we refer to as the blocking phases. So that's based on the patterns and shapes that we see that emerge from the brainstorming phase. And so then the project lead for that begins outlining the argument with descriptions of what we need to have in each section. And at this point, the document becomes less of a sort of free-for-all open space where each person is just going in and throwing in links and saying whatever, and more of a room that has a door. And that door is for the project lead. And the second author is always allowed. I mean, it's not that they're not, it's still their document, it's still their project. But they need to start, at this point, we start making it known, okay, I'm going to jump in the doc. Is that okay? Or are you in the middle of a thought? It's sort of making intentions known beforehand in case the project lead needs space or just wants to finish something before there's eyes on it. And within this, after each of these blocking passes, and there can be multiple, sort of depending on how far away we are from feeling comfortable with the argument. Some things we kind of have been circling around for a few years already, and so the blocking happens quickly. Other times we have to really work to get it in the shape that we want it. And after each blocking pass, the second author jumps in and makes comments on the emerging shape. And then we work together collaboratively, often through voice memos or text still, to course correct as we're going. And then with each of those exchanges, the blocking becomes more and more detailed as individual paragraphs start to emerge. And the writing is still very, very rough because the structure at this point is still going to naturally shift because we're giving feedback to each other on what needs to go. Oh, this needs to go up here. We think it needs to go down there. So there's absolutely no point in investing any time in making the prose actually good. We just want to get the ideas out there so we can arrange it appropriately on the page.
So then we move from blocking to drafting. Once we make that transition, the project lead begins to actually put the prose on the page in a more polished way, translating that blocking into a rough cut of the first draft. And so the project lead will do that. And once they are done, they'll hand the doc off to the second author, who then does a pass. And that second author will go through and make comments and make suggestions, but not line edits, especially not invisible line edits with no track changes or anything. And a lot of times during this phase, we'll schedule a meeting to talk through those comments, especially if there's big organizational stuff that might need changing, like we need to move this up here, or we really didn't develop this point the way that we need to. We'll exchange voice memos. We'll set up a synchronous conversation to talk about how to address those issues, and we'll leave it to the project lead to make the adjustment. So the second author doesn't just roll in and blitz stuff like I did before I went to Germany. Instead, it's a conversation where the second author is looking, making suggestions, making comments, and then having a conversation for the first author to then go through and make those changes. So the first author has a voice in the process, and you still have kind of a singularity in the writing process, even though the second author is involved. Really importantly, at this point, this is where we introduce a unique system that we've refined over the years, our ranking system for making any proposed changes. There will be times when we have a disagreement over everything from what example we should use to how we should structure things to what specific word goes best to whether or not to include a quote or not. And we'll have different opinions about what we should do about that. And when we come to those different opinions, the way that we will resolve it is we will both give a number 1 through 10 10 being the highest, I really want this, I really want it to happen. 1 being, I don't really care at all. 5 being somewhere in between. And the person with the higher number will generally have their way. I mean, it's more imprecise than that. Sometimes we'll have negotiations, we'll make trades. Okay, you're a 7 on this, I'm a 5 on that. I'll give you this if you give me that later. We'll bank 1 for later, those kind of things. But having that system of quantification, how important an idea is to someone, how important a passage, a thing to keep is to someone, having that quantification helps us know what's really important to the other person. And so then we can have our conversations from there. And that ranking system will be an instrumental part through all the drafting and editing that comes after this first draft.
Yeah, so then we move into the editing phases, and it takes a couple of forms, becomes more refined over time. The first phase, once you've addressed all the top line comments, the second author will dive in for the actual editing. And so all of those edits, they're done in editing or suggestion modes, green text mode and Google Docs. The project lead does not look at the document, does not read the comments. So in Gmail, for those of you who use the Google Suite, you know that if you're working on a collaborative doc and you make a change, or you add a comment or something, you get an email that tells you what the other person is doing. And our rule is do not look. That is not the time to look yet. So we just let the other person work and kind of give them, again, it's a room with a door. And that's the sort of privacy that we always afford. There are times, of course, when you want to peek in, but that would be a violation of that closed room. So we don't look at any of the comments. We don't engage in any way until after the second author is finished, formally opens the door and formally invites the project lead in. So the second editing phase builds on that. They go through and they accept all the edits that they're good with. Anything that the project lead is not sure about, they'll make a comment explaining why. And this might involve alternative language in suggestion mode, sometimes because showing what you're trying to say is easier than describing it. But there always has to be an explanation, an argument. I think that you are arguing this, or I think that this is what's happening, but this is what should be happening. So there's always an explanation. We always are showing our work to each other. And any big structural change at this point is not made until we're able to speak live. If we're going through and we realize oh, this section is not, something is wrong, we stop, we contact the other person, we talk about it, and then we make those changes. We put it in the doc and proceed as usual. But we're not making any decisions unilaterally at this point. So then the third editing phase, the second author takes another pass. And then they are addressing or trying to execute any of the suggestions that the project lead made on the last pass in phase 2. And this is where the ranking system becomes especially central to the process. We know each other's writing style and research style and thinking style really, really well. So we can usually tell when the other person is going to disagree or have some sort of investment in a phrase or idea or something that we would like to cut or include. And on those points, we really start to say, okay, well, I know that you're probably going to be, a 7 on this, but this is why I think we should do it the other way. Or I feel really strongly about this. I know you're not going to like it. It's going to be a place where we need to have a conversation. But it just is important quantifying it, making sure, you're not using any loaded emotional language. It's, look, I'm an 8. It's not anything against you. It's just, we're just talking about a numeric system. This is how I feel. And that makes it so that the ego bruising is really minimal, because you can get into a fight about someone, when someone says I hate the way you phrase this, but if someone is I'm an 8 on it, and then you say, well, look, I'm a 4 on it, it's a place to start that's sort of neutral. And then we go into an even further sort of iteration of that.
Yeah, where we've got the negotiations over just what's left, right? The points of disagreement. A lot of times during those editing phases, somebody will come through and they'll clean up a whole lot of the proposed changes because they're totally fine with them. And we get to this point where we just have the stuff to negotiate. And in these negotiations, like what was just saying, this is where you need to have openness, you need to have communication, you need to have equity, you need to respect the other person who's saying, no, absolutely not. And it ends up being real collaborative, a real back and forth as we especially as we've learned more the things that one person is more prone to and another person is less inclined toward, we can make those negotiations in good faith, knowing the person that we're talking with. I think one example that comes to mind is Whit likes a little more kind of linkages between chapters. She likes callbacks and look ahead.
I over transition. Yeah. That's what I do.
Something like as discussed last chapter, or more on that in chapter 2, right? Those kind of things. I don't like those. They throw me off when I'm reading. I just want to get from point A to point B. I want to tell a linear story. So a lot of times we'll have moments like that where Whit will have like, okay, I know this is a call out to a future chapter and you don't normally like that. Here's why I think we need it. And then I'll come in and say, what about if we softened it a little bit? I think I'd be a 7 on softening it. And she was like, okay, I'm only on a 5 on keeping it as it is. So we'll be good, right? So really the process here, the number system is really just to help make explicit something that should be implicit in any kind of co-authorship, right? Which is respecting where the other person is at, listening to the other person, getting a sense of what they think on things, being equitable in your decision-making, and kind of putting the collaboration first above where you're at as an individual.
Yeah, and in the name of time, so the final 2 phases, so final polishing, we go through this multiple times. The edits become more and more sort of focused and small as we move. And then we always schedule a call to talk through any last remaining things. We go through it one more time. So it's just a process over and over and over where we're always trying to be equitable, as Ryan just described. And then, things, usually there's a lull while you're waiting for an editorial response to something. And then, that's the proofreading phase. Sometimes there's weirdnesses if the editor wants to do it in Word doc and you've been working in Gmail, but or in Google. But it's really important just to be really communicative. I'm going to do this. What are you going to do? And allocate responsibility so everybody knows exactly what needs to be done. And so, as we said, this process has been, it has allowed us to get to a place where when we write collaboratively now, it's in this spirit of generosity. It's in a spirit of sort of wanting the other person to be happy. So not fighting. So when Ryan was saying we negotiate sometimes on the rankings, like, okay, well, I'll give you this if I get that. Yeah, we do that because we're worried about equitability. But often what ends up happening is that we end up having to gut check ourselves because we're being very conciliatory to the other person. I know you're going to want this transition. I know you're going to want this particular, verb tense thing that Ryan, he always likes to give inanimate objects possessive. So he likes to say that a day possesses certain qualities or something. So I know he likes that. And I want him to have that because I want him to be happy with the final product. So it really ends up being, how can we build this together and make sure that each person feels equally sort of comfortable and happy and proud of the work that comes out of it. And so that all is refined over years, 6 years, as we said. Yeah. But now we're entering this totally new phase of where we are in the project because we are translating You Are Here into a young adult book for, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds. And, although we did what we could to make the actual adult book of You Are Here accessible, interesting beyond academics specifically, it's also, it's a book for adults. Like there's no way around that. So, but that age group, those were the only readers that I think that we thought would benefit from this. So we leaned into our various experiences as this possibility kind of presented itself to us. I have a background in creative writing. I have an MFA in creative writing, in fiction, actually. Ryan has kids. He has 3 kids. So we decided, okay, so we might be equipped to do this, especially aiming it to, these teenaged readers who definitely need to have this shift in focus away from individual sort of rights, the sort of me first culture, which is really quite a thing in the United States that we have to work very hard against, towards a more communitarian ethic. But that raised all kinds of challenges.
Yeah, and challenges that are testing our writing process, that are testing our ability to bring You Are Here to new audiences. We're asking questions like how political should we be? How political can we be in terms of what younger audiences will get, in terms of what will still allow us to be assigned in grade schools and middle schools? How much detail should we give? How much theory should we use? Should we try to boil it down? Should we try to cut it entirely? And so we are in the process of going through the pre-writing steps we just mentioned to try to turn You Are Here into something that'll be accessible to a whole new generation of people. We first thought that we'd write it like a really kind of kids book oriented adventure story. That was a little too esoteric. We wanted characters and plot and those kind of things. And Candlewick Press was like, we want something a little more grounded. So we ended up settling on 4 elements from You Are Here that we wanted to integrate into this kids book that we thought would be accessible for younger audiences, but still carry the weight of the argument that we presented here at the beginning of this presentation. And so this is what we're currently working on.
Right. And so the 4 things that we sort of realized we needed to distill down, and we can talk about these in detail in the Q&A. We'll wrap up in just a moment, but, really focusing on narrative persuasion, how we could transport people into the story that we're telling. How can we really emphasize subjective recentering? So making sure that the reader was thinking about themselves as themselves, but in relation to other people. That's what you sort of using second person does. It implies not just, someone else, but all someone else's. So how could we really make it so that people were thinking about themselves, but thinking about other people in relation to those selves? We absolutely wanted to emphasize communitarian values, and we really wanted to emphasize an anti-racist focus and a critique of white supremacy, which, in the US, that can be, a bit of a third rail kind of a conversation in some contexts, but too bad that those are the conversations that need to take place. And so we're in the process of working on that. We're going to be submitting the proposal soon, fingers crossed, we don't know. But that's where we are with this particular project.
And so this is resulting in a book that carries the messages of You Are Here, but ends up looking very different than You Are Here. And the thing we're relying on as we build this different but similar thing is a consistency in our approach to writing, emphasizing in every possible way that the collaborative spirit we carry in our writing is also the message we want to send out to our audiences, right? That every I is a you, that you are one self among many others, and what you do impacts others, who then impact others, who impact others. So in a lot of ways, there's this really kind of compelling parallel between the collaboration and the collaborative spirit that we try to demonstrate as co-authors and the broader argument we make about how we want people, or how we could see people interacting best online, right? Thinking of others, being empathetic. And that in the end is what we think it's going to take to navigate through and out of the mess that we're in our informational landscape. We hope that these books, these messages will play a small part in shifting that thinking.
So thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm really looking forward to whatever questions you have.
It was like 2 talks in one. That was about 50 minutes. I think that's what.
Hey, we said 50 minutes. We did 50 minutes.
Did 50 minutes. So questions about any questions or conversations about both content and form, both about the writing process, the translation process, and about the arguments in the book itself. We welcome any and all of those conversations.
Thank you, Ryan and Whitney. That was great, and it really did feel like 2 talks for the price of 1. So really, I would encourage people to maybe, if you're okay with it, turn on your cameras, and if people want to interject with questions, comments, you can turn on your microphone and pose a question. I'm thinking, I was trying to think, how could one find a question that might link the 2 elements of the presentation? And I guess one of the things that came to mind was the question of ambivalence, because it seems to me a lot of your work is looking at forms of online subjectivity, where you're not sure if people are being earnest about something or whether they're I was going to use a very English expression, taking the piss. But Yeah, I'd ask you about that in terms of your own collaborative processes. Did you ever have moments like that between yourself, where one of you actually formulates an argument in quite an earnest way, and it's misconstrued by the other? Have you had moments like that?
Yeah, we both, I think, thought of the same example. So
okay, all right. Well, I'll start with it. So I don't know if anybody in the audience remembers the micro controversy around Bodie McBoatface in the United States. Yeah. So Bodie, I mean, God, that was so long ago. Well, it started
in the UK, and then
that's right. Global. Okay. Yeah. You were much more invested in all of this, and this was part of the problem. So why don't you give a little bit of background, please?
So yeah, gosh, when was that? Was that
2015?
2015. Yeah, mm-hmm. Bodie McBoatface. It was the powers that be in the UK sent out an online survey to name this research vessel that was going to be launched. David Attenborough was attached to the whole thing, and the one that won on the internet was Bodie McBoatface. They wanted to name this research vessel Bodie McBoatface, and the powers that be said definitively no. We are not. No, this is a serious endeavor. This is science. We are not naming this Bodie McBoatface. And so then it turned into this whole like quasi-ironic, but maybe not ironic deliberation debate about like the public sphere and the power of people's voices and the limits of direct democracy. And in the end, they ended up naming a submarine attached to the boat, Bodie McBoatface, but they did not name the boat Bodie McBoatface.
But so only because of public outcry. But so what was interesting though was that at the time, Ryan was on the side of like, you need to honor the vote. And there's a celebrity in the United States.
The people have spoken.
The people have spoken. You need to honor it. And so the people who were getting most upset about this, great democratic crisis were white dudes. That you had a lot of white men who were really pissed that they had voted for Bodie McBoatface, and they were having that opportunity taken away from them, and they were not happy about it. And Ryan, in the text, like as I recall, you were talking about it in this sort of like, this is a problem, and like it's not honoring public participation or something.
I was using it as a really earnest example of actual oppression. Yeah.
And I came in and I read that and I was like, what is this white nonsense? Like, what are you talking about in this? That the idea that you had all of these like tech type white dudes getting mad because a name they chose for a boat is not going to be named that boat name anymore. Like, there are people who have spent their entire online lives screaming and screaming about actual injustices, about hate and harassment, about all of these terrible things that are happening to them, their bodies, their lives. Nobody listens. Nobody's worried about public participation when Black women, for example, rightly call out the ways that social media incentivize and even encourage in some ways harassment against vulnerable populations. And so seeing this outcry of certain kinds of people, even if they thought it was kind of funny, it was like, this is you're assuming that public debate is democratic online. It's not. And so we had to have, I think that was one of the first sort of serious political conversations where we were not on the same page in terms of what we each thought of this example. And as I recall, I remember being pretty irritated by all of that.
Yeah, because I think the way I was writing it was, I think it mirrored a lot of the way that people were talking about online, which is like, it was very, so Poe's law, right? The online axiom that you often can't tell earnestness from irony, sincerity from satire. That was the tone, a lot of the Bodie Boatface conversation. People are changing their profile pictures. People were tweeting at the Queen. I don't know if the Queen has a Twitter, right? But that kind of stuff. And it was always a little unclear as to whether or not this was people actually being confronted on behalf of democracy, or if this was people taking the piss. And just kind of ramping up something for kind of fun and entertainment. And as I was writing it, it was to an important chapter about these actual real issues that Whit just mentioned. And I was writing it in this kind of half ironic, but kind of leaning into its style. And Whit at one point texted me or talked to me or whatever and said, like, are you joking or are you serious? And I had to think about it and say, I don't even know when it gets right down to it. And so I think that.
And then once we Yeah. And once we had a conversation because I think that you were a little bit surprised that I was so opposed to this line of inquiry. But once we talked about it from this, not from an internet lulzy perspective, but like, no, let's talk about the politics of what's actually happening here, what's being omitted here, then we were on the same page. And it's not like I needed to convince Ryan about, social inequities. It was just that register of online, like, trolliness or like pose-law-iness that was sort of obscuring the underlying political conversation from taking place, because it was all about like defending Bodie McBoatface.
And in the end, we did use Bodie McBoatface to lead off that chapter, but in a more responsible, earnest way. So there, I think, is an example of how some of these internet culture tensions dip into our writing and have had to be worked out in our writing process.
Mm-hmm.
Sean, you might be muted.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Kathleen.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, guys, for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. And it was interesting that it actually was on two levels, both on the meta talk on the book and like the content of the book. I also really wanted to say that I really like that you want to extend it to young adults. I don't think that happens quite enough. And I think it's really interesting and relevant for that group. I had a question about the comment, actually, right? The book is a field guide for people how to engage on the internet, as to say. Did you make like different field guides for different target audiences? Because at the end you said, right, it takes a very anti-racist approach. Is it also written for people who might share racist things or like conspiracy theories on their social media and what they could do or how they could do better or be more critical? Or was it mostly targeted at people like a bit more on the outside and how to engage with people more on the inside, as to say?
It's such a good question. And, mm-hmm. We really debated amongst ourselves, like who are we speaking to and what are we presuming about our audiences and how do we, and part of this too, and I'll speak interpersonal, or I'll speak of my own experiences at the time. The last few years in the United States have been enraging. It really, really frustrating and hard. And so then, a lot of the things that have been enraging is because a lot of people sort of buy into and replicate these racist, harmful ideologies. And there's a temptation to just throw your hands up and say, like, I give up, we can't, but then you potentially alienate readers who might be on the fence or who you could speak to, who might be able to sort of pull back from the really harmful and hateful ideology. Maybe they've never thought about it in these ways. And how do you not alienate them without also kind of coddling the MAGA contingent? That was hard to do. And so do you remember, Ryan, when did we come up with that cleaving between good faith and bad faith? Do you remember?
I think it was pretty early on as we were drafting the introduction, right? There's that really powerful line that, if you we're coming from a critical race perspective, from a feminist perspective, our politics are on our sleeve. If you are a conservative reader, we welcome you, but we welcome citizens of good faith, citizens who acknowledge that we do have a problem, that this is something that needs to be addressed. If you're a citizen of bad faith, is the way we put it. If you're someone who seeks to sow chaos, to stoke foment in the name of clicks for your YouTube channel or for lulz on Twitter or whatever, that's less the target audience. And so I think that we made that distinction out of kind of this frustrated exasperation that we just didn't know how much you could do if someone is of the mentality that more conflict is better, that I'm going to use this conflict and our political moment for my gain if I'm going to spread disinformation willingly to make a buck or to make a point. We were exasperated about those kind of actors in the system, and we wanted to instead focus on people trying to do their best no matter their political stripe. So I think that we made that distinction relatively early on. And then it ended up having an influence in how we wrote the book. So one example of this that immediately comes to mind. So again, how content and form are really, I think, mirrored and really parallel. So we talked about how these are two talks in one, but really I think they inform each other. So an example of this is chapter 1 in the book is this kind of historicizing chapter that talks about the Satanic Panics, which was a phenomenon in the US. I don't know how much it spread through Europe, where in the 80s and 90s in the US, there was a lot of connections between popular culture, heavy metal music, Dungeons and Dragons, even some sci-fi and fantasy stuff, and Satanism, and this kind of fear that through popular culture, Satanism would spread to our youth. And so we use it as this early example of kind of flowing misinformation and how it can have these effects. And so when I first went and edited the chapter during that editing phase, I kind of punched it up with a lot of jokes about Satan, funny names for Satan, a lot of jokes kind of at the expense of people who might literally believe that there was a satanic threat. And after I did that, we had a conversation about...
Well, because it was back and forth, because we did this like twice. And this was one of the places that I mentioned before we talked about the strategies, we had not fully figured this out yet. So I had written a very straight, very serious, and I guess the broader context of this is the ambivalent internet. We were being quite playful throughout it. And even though
it's a jokey book. Yeah.
It's a jokey book. And even though we ended up having this sort of, not contentious, but we had words about Bodie McBoatface, and we sort of were working through political, a changing political moment. So we were doing serious stuff in the ambivalent internet, but our tone, it was still a time when a jokey tone made sense in the United States, or at least it could be justified by two white people. And so it was fun and it was silly. And we had these moments where we tried to be thoughtful about Bodie McBoatface, but like we were also just trying to make each other laugh. So You Are Here comes around, we start working on that. I was the first author for the Satanic Panic chapter, and wrote it very straight, very serious. There was not a single joke. It was like heavy. So Ryan gets it. He punches it way up. Yeah. He hands it back to
Calling
me.
Satan old scratch and lots of devil puns and
basically like an ambivalent internet kind of take on the issue. So then when the editing phase switched over to me, I punched it back down. And then it went back to him. And then he was about to try to punch it back up again. And then we were like, okay, we need to have a conversation here. Because
so we had a general conversation about, how humorous should this book be? And we used the number system there, right? It was like a 4 at most. I think it really kind of ended up being, 3 sometimes in terms of humor compared to the ambivalent internet. But part of that conversation was, if you're a reader reading this chapter and you're of the Christian faith, if you're a citizen of good faith who believes in a biblical Satan, and we're sitting here, trashing you, making fun of you, making you the butt of our joke, then are you going to be turned off to the argument? And so that was, I think, a moment where we applied that distinction, and it ended up having editorial weight to it. Whereas, you'd assume that, maybe a more kind of explicitly evangelical Christian would be less inclined to read our book, and maybe they wouldn't be the target in group. And that might be true. But if there was someone who does want the situation to be better and also believes in a literal heaven and hell, we don't want to turn them off in chapter 1, because we want them to get through the argument we're making.
Yeah. I mean, and that's that. So it's that line between, you don't want to over cater to a sort of MAGA ideology, but also you want people to be able to be part of the process and part of the conversation and not alienate them in a way that could make it so that there's no possibility that they could get through the book. So it really was, it was sort of a guiding idea. And part of that too means we needed to tell the truth in the book. And so we weren't sugarcoating, what asymmetric polarization within far right evangelical circles did. We did not, pretend that certain consequences didn't happen. We didn't downplay the existence of white supremacy and how far right circles have really sort of propagated that through various wraparound media effects. We told the truth, but we weren't doing it in a way to dunk on anybody. We weren't doing it in a way where we were trying to make fun of anybody. People who are conservative, people who are Christian, people who might not be inclined to sort of agree with us, they may not ultimately agree with what we were saying, but there was still place for them at the table. And there just are things that, the right has to contend with if it wants to remain within the camp of good faith. And that was how we approached it. It was hard. And especially as COVID hit and all of the QAnon stuff started to coalesce with that, and everything just went bananas in the United States. And there was a lot of frustration and a lot of anger at who was causing that and what was happening as a result. But we still tried to not alienate people who might be able to become part of the project of healing what has been broken in the US and around the globe as well.
So thank you. Good question.
Yeah.
So please, anybody like to ask another question or comment? Maybe people can think of one. Does anyone want to claim the opening? Would be great. Okay.
The opening?
The opening for a question.
Yeah.
Maybe as people are thinking about maybe questions they could ask, I was just, as you were talking, I was just thinking about the ecological metaphors, which you put to work in a very suggestive, useful way, in terms of a kind of, you frame it in terms of a communitarian ethics, in a sense of one's responsibility to other nodes in the network, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering, and this is like a very big question, maybe this is a question that might come up in the context of the young adults book that you're working on. But I'm just thinking of the metaphors of land, soil, and so on, also have potentially a kind of reactionary resonance. You can think of them being operating within nationalist discourses. And I'm thinking that from the perspective of concerns that you sometimes hear voiced, that one way the far right could go in the future would be to kind of articulate its own version of a sort of ecological politics. And here you could think, and again, I guess the whole culture of memes is one where the meaning of things can easily float. Sometimes you don't have any control over that. So is that something you've reflected on in the book, how some of those metaphors could potentially be appropriated to do very different kinds of political work? Even the basic metaphor of pollution, you can think of how that could be put to work by a right-wing demagogue in very dangerous sort of ways.
So that's a really...
Yeah, I think that they could certainly appropriate the idea of sort of land and soil. They could use those words. They could use the word of pollution, but I think they would have a really difficult time appropriating the ways that we're using those metaphors, because the idea of communitarianism specifically, which suffuses the rest of the entire book, is that, it's all about positive freedom. So negative freedoms means, it's freedom from being told what to do, freedom from having anybody restrict your speech. Communitarianism is positive freedoms. It's freedoms for the collective to enjoy equally. So to have a far right demagogue try to appropriate that concept, they would have to then say everybody should be able to enjoy their speech equally. And the thing about far right demagogues is they're liars. They don't care about free speech. The only speech they care about is their own. And if they cared about free speech, they would defend the speech of people who were opposed to them, or who, for example, did not think that a white ethno-state was an appropriate way of being. But they don't do that. They're fundamentally anti-communitarian. And so for them to adopt a communitarian metaphor, they would have to change their entire politics, which I would definitely invite them to do. But this particular, could they use the words? Absolutely. But we are using the metaphors and the words in such specific ways. They are anti-fascist sort of by design. And the last image of the book in particular, we sort of are hinting at this throughout the book as well. The last image is of zooming up. So the higher up you go, the higher your perspective becomes, the more you realize that these boundaries that we create for ourselves, whether they're national boundaries or boundaries between groups, they start to dissolve. You can't contain the information that spreads. You can't contain influence, that those boundaries are always permeable. So there's not even a backyard that you could raise your fist and say, not in my backyard. There are no backyards. The higher up you go, the more you see and appreciate this connectivity, the more you sort of have the overview effect, right, of astronauts looking at the Earth. What the hell is a border? What the hell is a country? And so the more communitarian you sort of think about things, your relationship to the world, the more you realize, you know, when everyone is in it together, when there is a fundamental reciprocal relationship between global citizens, nationalism does not fit within that worldview. It can't. And that was something that we really were emphasizing throughout. So again, you know, if a white right-wing demagogue wanted to take on our ideals and have that influence their politics moving forward, good, because then they wouldn't be what they are anymore. It is fundamentally opposed to that sort of way of being. But it's a really interesting idea of thinking about how, you know, used in one way, a metaphor could have certain positive effects, but then used in another way, it could be opposed to that. And you're exactly right that memes are unwieldy and unpredictable. Yeah. So, you know, maybe that will happen and that will be very upsetting, but also they would be making a different kind of argument entirely.
So, yeah, I mean, my initial thought hearing that was, number one, it's a good point. And as you said, I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely. You could see kind of veering, at least in the kind of, initial vocab level read that way. But I think it might also speak to differences in maybe like the US political right and then maybe the political right in Europe. You said it and I'm like, oh yeah, I could see a right-wing demagogue kind of, appropriating that kind of like the purity of the land kind of stuff. That's not a lot of what the US right-wing does, right? They're too pro-industry, they're too pro-business. Maybe Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century might be talking in those terms, but the contemporary US rights, I don't see them kind of leaning on
climate change deniers.
Yeah, exactly. Ecological purity. Whereas maybe in a European context, maybe in a European context, it would be more readily adopted. So I think that also speaks to the kind of contextualism in metaphors, which is something to think about as you're writing. And we've thought about these metaphors on a lot of level because, yeah, anytime you make a choice to use some metaphor, you're excluding some other things. They do refine and guide how you think and talk about something. So in making that pollution decision, we had to choose that among all kinds of different frames for this issue. And it's always going to be a balancing act. And the best you can do is kind of pick a metaphor that you think fits your values best and then be clear at the connection between the thing that you're talking about and then the metaphors you're using to describe it.
Yeah, and actually, we've received a question / criticism in previous talks where someone basically said that by using metaphors of the land, we were preventing conservatives from being likely to listen to us because there's such a strong anti-climate science sort of vibe in the United States. That if you're using this language and if you are basing your metaphors on the premise that like we want the earth to not be polluted, that's going to be alienating to certain people, especially those coming at the conversation from, for example, like dominion theology, the idea that it's your job. You go forth and multiply, you use the earth in whatever way you want, and you don't consider the consequences. The focus is it's yours to use in whatever way you see fit. And sort of you have a divine right to do so in some ways. So if you're coming from that particular framework, that worldview, you're not going to be convinced by environmental protection metaphors. In fact, that might make you be pissed off because the metaphor in the United States is already so politicized. And so then this question that we got at this other talk was sort of like, aren't you alienating the right? And it's like, well, if we were to try to cater to people who are probably going to be inclined to disagree with us and use a metaphor that would appeal to them, then you alienate everybody else who wouldn't be. So it's really a question of there's no perfect metaphor. There's no way to protect the meaning of these things. But what are your values? What is most aligned with your values? And how can you make the most compelling argument to try to not lock meaning down, but make sure that the metaphor is doing the best, most communitarian, most justice-oriented work in the world that you can make it do?
Thank you for that. That's a great answer, because I mean, none of us in a culture, in an atmosphere of a lot of bad faith actors, none of us can control how our speech might be appropriate to sort of very different ends.
Yeah.
So,
what would I mean, out of curiosity, in Europe, would that answer be different? I mean, so like, could an environmental metaphor sort of work on the right?
That's an interesting question, and I'd love to hear somebody else chime in on this. But I was actually watching a seminar last night about the situation, the political economy, the cultural political economy of Hungary under Viktor Orban. Mm-hmm. And actually, in the context of the argument of your book, it's quite striking. One of the strong markers of Orban's politics is this profound hostility to liberalism. And the author said one of the reasons why Orban has been effective is that there is a kind of communitarian ethos articulated in his politics. But of course, it's a communitarian ethos that defines the community in terms of a white Hungarian identity. So I think that's, does anyone want to, I'm thinking there's different people that are participating today that have a much better understanding of kind of the environmental communication literature. So does anyone want to chime in on that point, or any other general questions on the talk? Come on, somebody. I'll terrify you all. I have 15 questions here, and I'll keep going until 6 o'clock, unless somebody asks a question. Nobody? Okay, one more that just since I've read the opening chapters of your book, you're obviously very mindful the argument is located primarily within the US, but you do gesture towards sort of locating it elsewhere. You talk about Bolsonaro and attending a conference in Brazil. So, I mean, to what extent do you explore that across the whole of the book, where you look at how these dynamics play out? To what extent is even the idea of the ambivalent internet, is that a sense in which it's a kind of updated version of the kind of media imperialism thesis, where the mores of American teenagers are sort of transmitted into cultural norms across the world? What's your sense of how the argument kind of, how it might look, how it might need to be adapted elsewhere?
Well, it would, I mean, so do you want to jump in, Ryan, or?
So yeah, my immediate thought was that we do kind of see continued evidence of the mores of the American internet being spread globally. The kind of imperialist angle of this, we use an example in the book, and I think it's in the introduction of a talk we were at in Brazil, where the speaker was talking about how changes in what it meant to be right-wing in Brazil were kind of these direct imports from what it meant to be right-wing in America. Things like freedom of speech at the cost of everything else. Things like advocating for gun rights. In particular, the speaker said that the idea of your personal freedom to own and carry a gun was never a thing in Brazilian discourse. In fact, because of unstable military history and that kind of thing, people didn't like guns on any side of the political spectrum. But within the last 5 years or so, the right to bear arms had become a big right-wing talking point in Brazil, and the speaker traced it directly to this kind of intermingling of the American right-wing talking points and values in the international internet. So I think that there is an argument for focusing on the United States because of that kind of continued cross-cultural influence. And I think the other element of it is that we as authors, as researchers, we are American, and we're doing really deep, really contextual, really culturally embedded kinds of research. And because it is so deep, it is so contextual, the only thing we can talk about is the cultural context that we're in, is the American cultural context. It would be in some ways kind of irresponsible for us to try to take who we are and what we know and apply it across the globe in all these ways. So the best that we can do is speak to the cultural context that we're in and give a lot of depth and context for that, look at the ways that it spreads out, and then invite other researchers, other thinkers, other writers from across the globe to then connect and apply and contradict some of the things that we're saying. So that's really, I think, how we try to balance that.
Well, and also, I mean, so yeah, we talk a little bit about the actual stuff, the sort of mimetic exportations, I guess, from the US. But where our criticism of the United States is actually strongest is not in the things that, start in the US. We are talking about the development of reification of particular kinds of cultural ideals and norms that are steeped in US American culture that then get embedded into large technology platforms, which are based in the United States and then exported to the rest of the world. So the rest of the world, they are not now and never have been subject to the First Amendment. But the First Amendment is this guiding ethos of so many of the social platforms that construct how people interact with each other from this US American perspective, the sort of absolutely US America first kind of, this is what we do here, and therefore this is actually a global model for speech, which is absurd and imperialist in all kinds of ways and totally unexamined. And so our criticism, the criticism of the actual memes that US Americans create, that's there, but it's more what happens when you have these anti-communitarian, super liberalistic, super neoliberal, super focused on individual rights, right? What do you do when all of those ideals get baked into these technologies that other people end up using? And what kind of impact does that have in other cultural contexts? And so where we started was with the United States has given something deeply polluted and deeply polluting to the global environment. And, we try, even though we are coming from this US American context, we try never to forget that there's other parts of the world. And at the same time, if we're going to deal with information disorder globally, we have to look at the pathology that the United States has inflicted upon the rest of the world around speech and around freedoms and around the things that are so aligned with US American ideals. And so that point of criticism and that point of awareness needs to be a starting point for a lot of scholars in our particular context, but is something that has to be contended with too. Like the rest of the world has to deal with the First Amendment. It would be better if they didn't, but that becomes necessary because of the way that we just imprint ourselves onto these technologies. So hopefully those kinds of conversations continue and persist. The imperialism of the structures of technologies. And so that was something we really put at the outset of the book, and then is something we try to unpack and tease out throughout the remainder of the chapters, knowing that they have these global contexts, even if we are speaking in the moment specifically about a US American situation.
Okay. Thanks, Bun. Neve Kirk. Neve, do you want to? I just saw a note. Do you want to unmute yourself and chime in? I can actually read it out, Neve, if there's a problem. This is Neve Kirk, who's based in UCD in Dublin. Neve says, I don't have an explicit question, but something I would like to hear the authors discuss. I am interested in the transnational dimensions of these networks and the flows from the US, UK, and European right into Ireland. And European right into Ireland. It is forming a sort of hybrid right, adopting characteristics from Anglophone countries and from Europe. So it sounds like your earlier answer kind of already anticipated that comment, but would you like to say more about that? Because Neve has a dog to deal with, so she can't.
I mean, so it's been, that hasn't been a particular research focus for us in the context of this book, especially as COVID has sort of further, COVID colliding with QAnon and then spreading out to all these different global contexts. That happening was after we finished the book. And if we were still working on the book now, I think that figuring out, looking at where the hurricane would flow, where Q would go around the world is something that we would definitely look into. So that wasn't part of the research for You Are Here specifically, but I will say from my own experience, I'm regularly contacted by journalists who want to talk about these various issues. I probably get more requests in Europe to speak to QAnon than I do in the United States these days.
Even though, yeah, it's at its heart a conspiracy theory about the U.S. government. There's branches and divergences all over the world. In Europe and Australia, it's so interesting to see a conspiracy theory at its heart about the U.S. government system have adherents in across the Western world, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and then it takes on local flavor. So it's not like adherents are just focusing on the U.S. context themselves. It's mapped onto local leaders. It's mapped onto local controversies, and oftentimes I can't speak to those local elements of this particular theory, but that always is this question from these journalists around Europe. Asking a U.S. American scholar to speak to this thing that's happening in whatever country around Europe has been really interesting and not at all surprising, given what we talk about in the book related to the actual polluted stuff that makes its way. Pollution doesn't care about borders. QAnon as an idea maps on really well to people who feel disenfranchised, whether or not they actually are, and who have internalized a certain fundamental mistrust of experts, of those on the left, of leaders of various stripes. So it becomes this sort of strange, easily adoptable meme, essentially, that then all the details get filled in based on the local environment. So how somebody, responds to the story in Europe, wherever someone is in Europe, it can't be exactly the same as how someone would respond to it here in the US, but the template is kind of the same, and the frustrations are kind of the same, and many of the demographics are kind of the same. So there's a lot of sameness, even though you do have these very localized global contexts for where these things travel.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see how those localized contexts do kind of collapse under the weight of these international networks. And you do see a lot of overlaps. One thing that was really interesting about writing The Ambivalent Internet is we were working with Polity Press, which is a press based in the UK. And so we were turning in The Ambivalent Internet before the US 2016 election, which means it was kind of right after Brexit in the UK. And we had turned in a draft to our editors at Polity, and basically we were like, we're really sorry about what is going on in the UK with Brexit. And they're like, we're really sorry about Trump. Let's hope that your result ends up better than ours. And then it didn't, right? And so you're seeing these kind of talking points and these kind of frames about the world pop up in these really international ways, right? This kind of international nationalism that you'll see pop up where a lot of white nationalists kind of adhere to very similar nationalism, but about their own kind of specific country. And it's really this kind of interesting oxymoronic kind of globalized nationalism. And I think that those flows in and of themselves speak to Whit's point about our borderlessness, right? That's the kind of congruent rise of this kind of nationalist protectionism that is spreading internationally via the internet is in and of itself evidence of the fact that we've got less borders than we think. So the very thing that is causing this rise is evidence of the kind of futility of that line of thinking.
Mm-hmm. And all the more important to try to apply wherever you can communitarian thinking and cultivating that, not just as a means to like clean up Facebook today, but how can you start in the context of the children's book, how can you start instilling those values in young people who are going to be the ones who ultimately inherit this mess. So if we start trying to get people and we're talking about our US context because we are not known to being sort of a communitarian people, at least at certain levels of leadership and ideology. So to have a shift in what the US ends up exporting, what the US ends up doing, we've got to start early with people, getting them thinking differently about their relationship to not just other American citizens, but citizens around the world. So the flows are both the source of our problem and then also potentially a source of some of the solutions or the beginnings of the solutions to some of those problems.
Thanks again to both of you for just such engaged responses to the different questions. And I really liked the presentation, the dual aspect of it in terms of the substantive argument of the book, but also reflect on your work processes as well. So Thanks to everybody for attending, and thanks to Whitney and Ryan. And I encourage people to read the book. I've started reading it myself in the last few days, and it's a really engaging text. So
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We'd love to hear what you think. Get through it.
Yeah,
Oh,
thank you so
right?
much.
We'd love to hear what you think as you get through it.
Yeah. Send us an email. Say hi.
Yeah.
And Kathleen is just waving. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah, something went wrong. I wanted to clap and then I was
Okay.
but thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really appreciate it, everybody, and take care and be safe.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.